Hello, I am Gus Zagarella, and we are not alive.
Speak for yourself on that one, dude.
Oh, hey, Anthony Gramuglia. Welcome to the channel.
I'm happy to be here. I'm glad I have joined the Legions of the Undead in this this collection here. Apparently,
We'll work on that. We'll get you your soul cage later, and you can separate it from your body, and, it's a whole process, but you are here, and I'm sure our audiences are pretty excited because there's some overlap there, but they didn't know this collab was coming.
no one knew. There's a big secret, and we didn't try recording this the first time either, at all. This is not the second attempt at the third attempt, really.
Somehow the Star Wars video returned.
Somehow Star Wars returned.
We're talking about Star Wars today, which is completely uncontroversial. Nobody has any hot takes about it. In fact, it's that old movie series from the 70s and 80s that, really just kind of, it was influential in its time, but did it really have any kind of lasting pop culture? It was really the James Cameron's Avatar of its day.
Yeah, it's really strange. They never made a fourth Star Wars film. It's very unfortunate. They just stopped after Return of the Jedi. They're like, you know what? Enough is enough. We're done. Let's hand in the chips. We're good.
Now, I know that's not true because I have seen your videos on Andor, and we will be talking a little bit about Andor, but we are going to take it back to that original trilogy and sort of discuss the vibes of it. Because I'll admit, I'll be honest, I've kind of bounced off Star Wars a lot of the times that I've tried to get invested in it. And that, does come down to preference, but I think there is something particular about the way it constructs its mood and its world that I find really uncanny. And that is why this video is titled Why Star Wars Feels Fake. And I think we'll start at the very beginning of that first movie with the opening crawl.
That's lifted heavily from the old serials from the 1920s and 30s. Because, back then you would go to a matinee showing at your local theater and they'd play one of the old film serials like Flash Gordon or Buck Rogers. And you might catch an episode, in the middle of the serial. You might catch episode 4 of 19. And you really couldn't go back and rewind to the old episodes. You couldn't binge watch them. If you missed it, you missed it. That was it. So those crawls helped catch you up to speed so they could just jump into the action, usually with a cliffhanger from the previous episode.
Absolutely. And, Flash Gordon was a big influence overall on, the way the world was constructed. Unfortunately, I haven't tracked down some of those original serials, but I did watch the adaptation that came out in I believe it was the late 70s or early 80s. Don't quote me on the exact date, but I saw that. I've also seen Flash Gordon, which the less said about that, the better for the sake of monetization.
You ever see the sci-fi series, Flash Gordon? It's totally irrelevant, but that's a goofy one too.
Oh, no, I haven't. But I overall think it is, very emblematic of a certain kind of, very loose astrophysics style of sci-fi where, it was basically, continents in the sky, space seemed like it was just a short vessel ride away, and everything was the same biome. There was forest planets and desert planets, and does carry over a little bit into Star Wars. And so there was something you were telling me about the way that these old movie sets were constructed, like sort of getting the most out of very limited environments.
Yes. So with a lot of these sets, they designed them to be very easy to. A few I actually looked this up since I last told you this. There's a few other details I missed. They designed them to be easily refitted with different textures. So let's say you want a snowy planet, you can just dump some snow onto the pre-existing styrofoam blocks you had set up. Let's say you wanted to add some trees. Well, they had some trees on standby. They would just roll them onto the set in the background. And they were designed to be very easy to customize for a given shot. Or they would film in real locations in the area, like, for example, some of the deserts that they had outside of LA area. There are certain caves that they filmed a lot of serials at. There's one cave in particular that's in 300 different movies and little serials and TV shows. The Bat Cave from the Adam West Show was filmed there. A Robot Monster was filmed there. And what they would do is they'd use the same locations and just dress them up as something distinct. So the snow planet would just be they put snow on it. The desert planet would be just the desert. They would do these things to make them very simple and straightforward. But they'd only have one or two sets, and they just would cover them up, decorate them differently to be different biomes. And, the snow planet would be all snow. There would be nothing else but snow. There might be a matte painting. That was about it. The fire planet would just be fire, And that was meant to communicate quickly without really delving into the specifics, what each world was like.
It was a very economical style of conveying a world to the viewer. And like the opening crawl, which its purpose was give the basic bullet points of who is who, so that the audience from the first moments of the film doesn't need to be asking a ton of questions. Those are sort of dramatically presented to them and resolved in, we know who the bad guys are, we know who the good guys are, we know basically what the stakes are. Rebel versus Empire, there's Darth Vader, there's all this stuff. And the planets, in a very similar way, kind of draw from these old, multi-use, very simple sets, in that while the technology had advanced by the time that they were making Star Wars, there was this intention to kind of replicate the emptiness and the thematic opacity of some of these environments.
Well, the thing is that you can very easily communicate what a planet is like if it becomes dominated by one type of ecology. Tatooine is the desert planet. It is the desert. Hoth is the snow planet,
Yeah, and these environments will convey something emotionally about how we're meant to feel about that. In Hoth, it's supposed to be this stark, harsh environment where a battle is taking place, and adds to this sense of desperation and that they need to leave. Whereas Tatooine's desolate nature and the fact that the only sort of beautiful thing there is these two suns above the plains, it makes it feel like Luke needs to get off the ground and go somewhere and adventure. Cloud City, even while there is a cosmopolitan sort of vibe to it, you mostly just see the big clouds, and you have to sort of imagine what the rest of the planet looks like. And it's I think what's fascinating about these things is that they have a kind of liminality to them, because you can imagine that over the horizon there is just more of whatever environment is already present. Sure, we could try and piece together what's over there and go over there, but it doesn't really matter, because what's immediately in front of us is the set in which important characters are sort of acting out this space opera.
And more than that, too, the sets can also inform the conflict we're dealing with. Go back to A New Hope, Yavin 4 is a big forest. There's an old temple there. The technology the rebels have is antiquated and kind of archaic, versus the Death Star, this shiny, glimmery ball of technology. It really does illustrate that despite the rebels being rooted to this old, maybe historic place, that the Empire is this industrial force, this chrome, advanced sort of thing. And it makes the conflict feel all the more potent, that there's a sense of history and mysticism versus the modern, current machine of war. And that's very clever what they do there. And it's deliberate, I'm pretty sure, on Lucas's part. He was very mindful to incorporate the rebels with old technology, with ruins, with desolate locations, when the Empire was always this black and white, shimmering, technologically advanced sector. But what you don't see too much are living areas. You see homes, you see little outcroppings of civilization, but you really don't see, how you do in the prequels, the massive cities and the with Coruscant, for example, an entire planet that is a city. It's heavily lifted from the Foundation series, where there is a planet that is just a giant colossal city.
Even then, I would say that Coruscant conveys a city because the point of it is to be a city. And while we do get specific, there is this feeling that everything that exists in this universe, even in the prequels, which do get try to attempt to be a little bit more political, there's a very big emphasis on the semiotics of things rather than the how these people survive and how they sort of what they do daily. Because Tatooine, for example, the moisture farmers, we don't really see like what the market is for that. Do they sell the moisture to the Empire? Do they use it just to survive? Do they go anywhere else? Does any of this matter when like right down the road there is a bar that has like plentiful drinks and aliens from all over the place and who don't seem to be bothered by the desolate nature of Tatooine and seem to like come here to do all sorts of business?
Oh, 100%. And you look at it like this also, if you compare Tatooine to Arrakis from Dune, moisture is such a huge part of Dune the book, where they have all these different means of collecting moisture, how it's a form of currency of an almost religious and sacred value. Whereas moisture is never seen as all that important on Tatooine. No one ever talks about conserving sweat. There's no still suits on Tatooine. They give out drinks so easily, you know?
It's because of the sort of difference in priorities, because Star Wars is so much more about like, if Luke doesn't emotionally feel like he needs to be drinking water in that scene, he's not going to be drinking water. Like, and I think what this does come down to is like source medium as well, because Star Wars is very much drawing from serials, but if you look at something like Dune or Lord of the Rings, which, because I would argue Star Wars is not sci-fi as much as it is science fantasy.
Agreed.
When you look at these other things that come from like book series, you get there are like conlangs, there are like deep details into like why certain groups like ventured out to certain areas or settled in other areas, where all these like creatures fit into an ecosystem, and you don't see that in Star Wars until the sort of Wikipedia-fication that came much later beyond the original trilogy and even beyond the prequels, honestly.
Oh, yeah, no, I would say the guidebooks being published back in the 90s were the real turning point for Star Wars as a franchise. Like, the expanded universe is what really had the elements that came into play. Here's the thing. Do you know where it was first revealed that chocolate actually exists in Star Wars?
Oh, sweet chocolate. I've always hated it. No, but where, though?
It's in the Heir to the Empire books, the Thrawn trilogy. They mention cocoa because they make cocoa as a drink. They casually mention it. And when you realize that they had not actually confirmed that chocolate or cocoa or anything like that even existed in the galaxy far, far away, you take a step back and you go, wait a second, hold on. I just kind of assumed it did, but they're acting like it's some foreign, unusual thing. And you're like, wait a second, really? That's interesting. And it really puts into perspective things.
Exactly. Well, because we have like really no idea what is on any of these planets, their sheer size and the very small snapshot we get to see of them, because, you know, the original trilogy especially was about these larger than life characters whose journey through the steps of the monomyth so eclipsed anything that was happening in the background that we don't really even get a sense of scale for these planets, to the point that like when Alderaan is destroyed by the Death Star, our emotional sympathy for like Leia's position is more what we feel than the people of Alderaan are gone, because we didn't know them and we don't know what the measure of a planet is in this universe.
Yeah, we barely see Alderaan in any capacity across any of the films. Like, I know the expanded canon elaborates on it. I think Clone Wars shows it. I think the end of Return of the Jedi shows it. I think the Obi-Wan show shows it as well. But, like, all of it is very minimal. It's very like, oh, Alderaan exists. It is a planet. People are on there. But we don't really get a sense of meaningful attachment to it.
I think this can help us sort of bridge the gap into Andor, which I found really fascinating. Like, you have great videos on it, and I think the audience of this video should definitely watch those if they want a Star Wars fix from somebody who probably thinks about this franchise deeper than I do generally. And that's a compliment on your part. I have kind of a reputation over here as almost a Star Wars hater, but, you know, it's I try to be even-handed about it. The plight of the people of Gorman and the way that everything about that society, their culture, the basis of, like, you know, the spider weaving, but also the minerals underneath their planet, all of that is explored in great depth to a degree that we really wouldn't see. Like, in a different Star Wars movie, it would be like our heroes go there, they go like, wow, this sucks for them. And then they're like, well, where's the next place we have to fight the Empire? And then they would go there.
Compare how in The Force Awakens we see the capital of the New Republic. These various planetary systems being destroyed by the Star Destroyer. Like one fell swoop, they're all dead.
Starkiller Base.
Oh, it's terrible. It's one of those scenes where like you watch and you go, wait, what just happened? Why do I care these planets got blown up? And then you realize afterwards, oh, it's the capital of the New Republic. This is the center of government that was just destroyed. Meanwhile, in Andor, you see comparatively much less violence, or at least much less destruction, but more violence, I should say. And it's more impactful because you get to know the people who are being hurt or killed. You get a sense of who they are, what they're fighting for, what their lifestyle's like, what their culture's like, how inexperienced they are. And they do it by establishing a few key characters who will play a role in the narrative to come. And we see the buildup in government. We see it from every level. We see it from the Empire's perspective, from the Senate's perspective, from the average person's perspective, to the rebellion's perspective. And you see so many facets of this conflict so continually. It really anchors your attention in terms of like, okay, what's going on? How does it play into everything? What's at stake? And once you realize that, it's incredible, because once you realize that, you realize that you can show very little, but it's more impactful. Whereas the sequel trilogy shows a lot sometimes, but you don't feel anything.
I think the example of like Starkiller Base destroying those planets is like a perfect, like, trying to sort of recapture and one up the original trilogy, but misunderstanding that like doing it this way makes it even more artificial.
100%.
Force Awakens in particular, and to some extent, like, big shocker, my favorite of the sequel trilogy is The Last Jedi. We're not going to get into it, really. But I feel like the films that preceded it and go after it feel especially artificial, because so much of what they're trying to do is to be Star Wars. Not in a, like, we're telling a story with the Star Wars universe and rules, but to be Star Wars. And I think in doing that, they kind of embrace artifice. I think Andor is such an interesting counterpoint to all of that, because it does feel intensely real and on like every single level. And there are characters in Andor who, like, the existence of them presupposes a deeper complexity to these issues than farm boy turns into samurai spaceman and defeats evil dark man who wields the dark power. There's a friction there. I'm not saying that people have to like one or dislike the other, but there is certainly a friction there.
100%. The way Andor sets it up too is it's brilliant because it shows the human side of Star Wars. You really get a sense of why someone would want to work in the Empire. You get a sense of why someone would want to exist in this world. You get a sense of how someone would be radicalized by the injustices of the world. You get a sense of how vacations work, how jails work, how farming works, how the migrant culture works.
One of my favorite things about Andor is that it has themes all its own, apart from being like, the light side versus the dark side, the taking down of the fascist regime, stuff that was very like overtly put in by George Lucas to kind of reflect his opinions on Empire, but also on like New Age kind of mysticism and philosophy. I like that Andor really is about the plasticity of people who don't belong and what they might do in order to find a place that they belong. The juxtaposition between Cassian Andor and Cyril, last name? I don't remember his last name. I barely remember who that guy is.
Cyril. Like, yeah, I know he has a last name. And it's funny. When getting clips for Andor, I definitely heard his last name repeated, but I forget what it is off the top of my head.
He is kind of a forgettable guy, and I think that's the whole thing about Cyril, is that while Andor is someone who, because he lost his home, he lost his family, he doesn't really have a place to go back to or any set person he needs to be, he can fulfill any role as a spy. And I think it's interesting showing that, like, the Empire, in the way they rule the galaxy, there is always a position that someone needs to occupy, otherwise they are deviant and must be destroyed. And Andor takes advantage of that by so believably taking whatever role is given to him. Whereas Cyril is trying to do the same thing and find the like spot within the hierarchy where he belongs, but in doing so, he like forgets that he's wearing a mask, and he forgets that like what other people decide for you in the Empire is where you go. And so he's kind of delusional about his agency in all of it, whereas Andor embraces the lack of personhood that he has, and that becomes his greatest weapon.
Exactly. And what's funny too about Andor and Cyril's relationship is that Cyril kind of measures himself against the rebellion. He measures himself against Andor. Whereas Andor doesn't see Cyril as an individual. He sees him as just a cog in the machine. Without spoiling some of the more poignant, one of the more ironic scenes for Cyril's
Yeah, dramatically
arc,
ironic. It's brilliant.
Incredibly so. He spends all this time trying to hunt Andor down, and Andor doesn't even know who he is. Like, it's so clever and sad.
I think that Andor, like, is like, even just as like a sci-fi series on its own, it's really well written, and there's a lot of intentional ambiguity to play with there. There's a lot of levels of interpretation, whereas getting back to the original trilogy, there is a kind of lack of ambiguity owing to the kind of bluntness of a lot of George Lucas's dialogue, the fact that the way he directs actors is often pretty wooden. Don't get me wrong, it fits in line with the kind of like lines of dialogue that are sometimes written in, a lot of which were left out in the edit. Like there was that one that you almost got into hot water about including in your video.
Yeah, that one. The one that the what was it? The
young Mark Hamill as Luke Skywalker goes like, fear is their greatest defense, and the forces that they do have will be amassed towards a frontal assault. Like it was a kind of like crazy like the idea that a like farm boy who just started his like crossing of the threshold is gonna just rattle that off the dome is a like, okay, you can see the strings of the puppeteer. Like, this isn't fooling anybody. It's very clear that like a play is being put on here.
Well, the problem is George Lucas never really understood how to write human beings. Like he knew how to write these big ideas. He knew how to write these cool concepts, but human dialogue, and it's not just Mark Hamill. Apparently, from what I understand, Harrison Ford and Carrie Fisher would quietly rewrite their own lines consistently. Like very few of Harrison Ford's lines were written by George Lucas. Like, he just would rewrite them constantly because he was like, this sucks.
Yeah, like, so Harrison Ford was constantly ad-libbing, and some of the most iconic lines, the like, I know, in response to Leia's I love you in Empire, were just, like, from Harrison Ford. But also, credit to Carrie Fisher, she was a straight up, like, script doctor across the entire trilogy of just, like, rewriting entire things. And then George Lucas's wife also re-edited a lot of the stuff to get rid of the kind of like more egregious moments of just like, you know, characters just kind of stating the lore of the series in a very like, you know, again, like very operatic, very melodramatic way. And that is fine if like the intention is to tell stories about like Jungian archetypes clashing. But again, it's like you said, it's like these don't really come across as authentically human beings. And that is why a lot of the times I think there is just a lack of dialogue and silence in those original movies, a silence that is implied but is otherwise filled by the John Williams score, which is so iconic that like to the point that like I think when people think about the kind of Star Wars trilogy, they remember a lot of the big moments. It is the bridge of the John Williams soundtrack that gives these stories their lasting staying power. Otherwise, we'd kind of be looking at a lot of downtime and a lot of just characters wandering through big empty environments.
You know, it's funny you say that too. You know, you mentioned also George Lucas's ex-wife re-editing the film. You know, you look at the contributions of John Williams' music and George Lucas's ex on the film. Lucas originally had a lot of long stretches of silence where the characters explained the world to people. You know, a lot of the scenes that were cut, it was exposition to establish the setting. A lot of that was communicated through the tightening of the edit, thanks to George Lucas's ex-wife, but also through John Williams's music. A lot of the things that are outright stated in the scenes Lucas had cut that were cut from Lucas's original version, they're communicated through the music, through the swells and the feelings you feel while watching certain scenes, like the twin sunset scene, for example, the sunrise sunset scene. That communicates so well the forlorn isolation that Lucas spent so many scenes originally trying to establish. A few notes tells you everything you need, and that impressionistic storytelling with the music, I think, really helps give Star Wars, especially the original trilogy, its edge. Because it's fast-paced, you're never bored, and you don't need everything spelled out to you. Because you can pick up on it, you can sense it, you can understand it, you can comprehend it, without ever having to spend all this time watching and experiencing and all that. There's so much going on through implication.
It is definitely something that is meant to be incredibly evident and unambiguous on a story level, very unambiguous emotions that are showcasing the echoes of a monomythic storytelling, which, while it was still being explored, like, I think Lord of the Rings was the thing that was starting to popularize the Joseph Campbell way of telling stories. It was Star Wars that brought that first to the big screen and, in a way, kind of codified how plug and play that the beats of that story can really be.
Exactly, 100%. There's so many pieces you just play around with in that sense. I agree with that entirely.
And I think, and that transitions into the Force, because, obviously there is, in Lord of the Rings, there is an evident sort of higher power and, a spirituality reflective of Tolkien's own religion. Whereas with George Lucas, we do also get that, but it's a mishmash of all religion and all spiritual beliefs. It's a kind of vague gesturing at the mysteries of the spiritual, and that's the Force. It's a magic system so soft you could just curl up and fall asleep in it.
Yeah, basically. Well, it's funny too with Tolkien, since we were discussing that too. It's very clearly inspired by Catholicism. It's very much. The system is the history of Eru and all that with Tolkien is so thoroughly explored, whereas the Force is this ambiguous, ever-shifting kind of thing. And I think it's because Lucas drew more heavily from samurai films when making Star Wars. The idea of mysticism, of Buddhist belief, of spirits and entities all around us, as this sort of balance between man and nature. I think that really feeds into the Force and how it is communicated on screen in Star Wars. But at the same time, you get a sense of, okay, well, now we have the Force. Now we have this bigger cosmic power. How do we communicate it? Well, there's a balance. There's a light and a dark side. It has to be in balance, and it's out of balance right now, and that's why we got to solve everything.
And I think, even in, the one, rule that it's given consistently across the trilogy, that there is a light side and a dark side, there is a kind of vagary there. It's very, morally simplistic is what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. And the thing that bothers me is, and this is something that I think was elaborated on more much later, but not really enough in my opinion, the idea that the dark side is good or evil. I never liked that concept. I like it more when the dark side is presented as the sum total of negative emotion. People plunge into darkness due to their own insecurities, searching for answers, searching for a solution, searching for power, and that drives them to self-destructive means. The dark side, I like it when the dark side is less evil magic and more the pursuit of the easy solution versus the hard solution and the destructive results therein. How giving in to feelings that are toxic and dangerous can lead to short-term gain at long-term deficit. But Star Wars tends to ignore that, I think, unless it's Darth Vader.
Yeah, I think like symbolically that is like borne out in the way that dark side users in the original trilogy use their powers. Like, Palpatine wants to hurt a guy, and look, lightning bursts from his hands, he's hurting him. Like, Darth Vader wants to pick something up or choke someone out, and he can just do that. And while the light side users can also use telekinesis, they rarely use it to directly attack other people. Like, the dark side seems to be all about like quick and dirty solutions, which does, in an odd way, distance it from the underlying mythological beliefs that it would be pulling from. Like, the yin yang is not a like binary good evil. It is balance, and neither side is inherently evil. I think there's a sort of like westernization or a Christianization of what the Force is, but because it isn't even wholly that, it is just this like, it's whatever you want it to be, man, but don't fall for that dark side. The Force just helps out our perspective characters and hinders or is the ultimate undoing of the villains, while occasionally serving them only to create temporary obstacles for the heroes. Got it. Again, you can see the strings of the puppet master.
Oh, yeah. And what sucks is that fans have become so hardline to accept there are certain things you can do with the Force at certain times, both the light and the dark side. It's like you have to rank up in level to get this.
Yeah, like one of the Game Boy Advance games where you do the branching paths and you get your different Force powers. I think one of the most damning moments, maybe across the entire like Disney-owned section of the franchise, is when Han Solo in The Force Awakens goes, "That's not how the Force works." And it's like, since when did Han Solo become an expert in the Force? Is it because he's an older character from like the original trilogy? And also, like, how does anyone know what the Force, how it actually functions? Like, least of all Han Solo. And I don't think you would have a Jedi or a Sith saying that. Like, I don't think you would have like Palpatine or Snoke or Obi-Wan or any of these people going like, well, actually the Force doesn't work like that. They'd say some like esoteric koan that you're meant to, like, if you're a good guy, you're meant to interpret to advance your status towards like narrative completion, whereas if you're a villain, it's meant to like undo and confound you. I will give credit to, I do think there is an interesting sort of moment of Force interaction in The Last Jedi when Rey goes down into that weird pit underneath the island. And
oh, I love that bit.
Yeah, and she just sees like tons and tons of herself. And for me, I thought that was always showing that like Rey doesn't have a sense of self other than this like imitation of the legends that came before her. And so her truest like answer to who she is just more reflections of herself repeated ad infinitum in both directions. She knows she exists, but she doesn't know where she came from and where she's leading. And that's why this like sort of like this attempt to kind of grasp her parents, which would be her one way into her identity, is such a powerful character moment. It's a good thing they really didn't mess that one up or walk back on it completely.
Yeah, right? Well, it's funny too with that scene. My interpretation of it also is that the dark side offers possible answers that lure you deeper into it. That whole moment is like playing upon her insecurities. Where does she come from? Who is she in this story? And all the dark side shows is it's just herself. And it's meant to kind of keep her going deeper and deeper in, but like she just feels empty and she doesn't get any answers, so she just walks away on her own terms, which is unusual. I think the dark side is meant to tease and suggest and draw you in deeper, which again, it makes it emblematic of like of depression, of insecurity, of vulnerability, being exploited by some forces beyond your comprehension. And I think it's really clever how they do that. It really suggests more than anything else that the dark side is itself this sort of nebulous chasing the dragon kind of existence. And why so many other of the Sith, except for Darth Sidious, who is in complete control of himself and completely aware of how depraved and awful he is, every single other dark side user that we see, to some extent, is this sort of bleak, lost figure looking for answers.
Overall, that is a really good way to frame the dark side. But you hit on something interesting there about Palpatine, where it feels like whenever he is implemented in these like mainline movies, he is, and I would say this even extends to the way that his shadow is cast over Andor. Palpatine is an incredibly plastic figure because whatever like idea of evil is trying to be conveyed by it, Palpatine is a self-aware instigator and exemplar of that concept. Like at the end of the first trilogy, it's time to test whether or not Luke's like rage will overpower him. He's just doing a beat for beat like atonement with the father from the Joseph Campbell thing of let's see if Luke will achieve his theosis and like return to the source of his being and overcome the hatred in his heart. And it's like Palpatine really, like realistically, he didn't need to do that. He could have just killed Luke and been done with it and then gone on being the Emperor. And then we switch gears and go into the past, and it's like, well, it actually was about the death of democracy and seizing control of everything and, you know, being an autocrat through, like, you know, deception. And then, like, sort of grooming Anakin into his second in command by playing on, like, Anakin's own, like, fears and insecurities and, like the fear of death. And then we go to the sequels, and he represents, like, the old dangerous threats are coming back, but good can win out even now. And then in Andor, he is this like unilaterally overreaching figurehead who has a ton of like, you know, lower men on the totem pole who are too willing to sort of kiss up to him as sycophants to not turn away from the inhumanities they're committing. And I think in all of that, Palpatine's not a consistent character. He is absolute evil, though, in whatever form the writers decide to give it. But never at any point does I think that gel into Sheev Palpatine or Darth Sidious or whatever he's going by being a character in a sense that I would apply to other works outside of Star Wars.
No, I agree with that to an extent. I think what's interesting is that Palpatine, in many ways, I think if there is a consistency to Palpatine, it's that he represents the corrupting influence of evil and despotism. You know, I think he's most compelling in the prequel trilogy because he has something he's trying to get. You know, he has an objective he's trying to reach. In the original trilogy and sequel trilogy, he has it already. He already has accomplished what he wants. I mean, yeah, Rise of Skywalker, he has to get his last little, you know, fine-tuning of it. But he's already basically has everything he wants there. It's just he has everything to lose at that point.
Yeah, like in the prequels, we do see like a guy who has to, despite feeling very evil-coded from the start, he does indeed have to like, you know, go to his Senate job. He does have to like, you know, talk to people. It isn't like, you know, long have I dreamed of a victory of darkness and death and
yeah, right,
you know, like that's just like, I think it's like from that point on, being the main villain is his whole personality as opposed to how he's portrayed in the prequels.
The thing that's so funny is it's so clear he loves being evil. Like, it's not like anyone else. He just enjoys being a vile monster from like start to finish. Like, he just has such a great time, which is why it's so easy to like the character.
Because like Emperor Palpatine, he's almost like a cosmic meme. It's like wherever the dark side is in any given story, he like gravitates towards it and being like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm gonna punch in and do some dark side stuff. I love it. Even if I die, I'll come back at some point and do more dark side stuff. That's just my lot in life, and it's awesome.
And he's so great because his whole thing, he's driven just by the drive to be vile, to hurt others. And in Andor, he works best in the shadows. He works best as the suggestion of evil. I think in most of the post-prequel era, he works better as this established force of evil because it's more interesting to see how his corruptive evil influences that around him than to ever have him show up in person. Because, like, he's no longer pursuing a goal. He has a goal, you know? He has the power he seeks. So it's not as interesting to see him as it was in the prequels because, well, he's gotten there already. He's already become the system. And all of the Empire exists as an extension of him.
Yeah, and one thing that I do really like about the way that he exists in Andor, and I think, like, the sequels, obviously, in Rise of Skywalker, very much went the opposite direction, is that it feels like with Palpatine and Vader at the head of the Empire, the idea of, like, the Force existing and influencing people's lives at all, it feels like, the powers that would balance the universe are so far distant. And like to the point that like you get that stuff from Grand Moff Tarkin in the original trilogy of like calling Vader clinging to like an old religion, and you get the sense that like it was all about power, but not necessarily dark side power. And Andor does make it feel like the Empire, with or without the Force, they're going to do the fascism and the imperialism that like every sort of rung of their whole operation. And I find that a lot more compelling than like the total awareness in the sequels of like it's all or nothing. Like, we have to defeat the dark side, and it really comes down to a 1v1 of these different space wizards. And likewise, the prequels in the Jedi Order, while there was an attempt was made, like, there were themes there. They tried to do a lot with the concept of the Jedi, and it's like extremely limber where they can't fill in an actual real thing for them to do. They fill in with Obi-Wan signifiers, like for example, the robe that Obi-Wan wears, which was him undercover, is suddenly the uniform in the past. Exactly. It doesn't gel.
No, 100%. I agree with that. And there's elements too. One thing funny too with the prequels and in the original trilogy and the sequels is this. If you look at the final fight that resolves, that's like wraps up each story, neither final fight actually is what resolves the true conflict of the Empire or of Order 66. Like, Obi-Wan beating Anakin doesn't stop Palpatine from taking over. And Palpatine being slain by Darth Vader, likewise, that's cathartic to see, but what wins is Lando blowing up the second Death Star with Vader and Palpatine on it.
And a bunch of cuddly little Ewoks that are like, going up against the Empire, which that feels so in line with Lucas's vision of like, the underdogs triumphing over Empire. It is silly in a very Lucas way, but you know what? I do at least give points for living in that sort of Camp Flash Gordon world. A lot more Star Wars media could hope to embrace. And from what I've heard, stuff like Skeleton Crew is.
Oh, 100%. Skeleton Crew absolutely does embrace that. But just to finish my point there, the sequel trilogy is the only trilogy where the final fight actually ends the conflict. That it is somehow anchored to Palpatine in particular having to be slain to stop the First Order.
It's very Star Wars through a funhouse mirror. And especially if it's just kind of reflecting, like, the iconography, all you get is a distortion of, like, the most memorable bits from a marketing perspective of the original trilogy. I think the iconography itself is worth sort of addressing as kind of the reason I think Star Wars lingered is because, like, we could talk about, like, the dialogue, the emptiness, the scale, like, all these sort of, like, vibes that, like, tie it together. But overall, there are these, like, the lightsaber, the AT-AT, the X-Wings, the TIE Fighters, like the Death Star, Vader himself, Palpatine himself, Chewbacca, like these things that have come to basically mean, like, this is a Star Wars. You look at that, that's a Star Wars, but it doesn't mean anything else other than look here and find Star Wars.
Exactly. Well, the thing is, the first film became successful because it was such a huge blockbuster hit. It was such a major, like, film in film history. All the effects were groundbreaking. All the stuff was incredible. And people forget it was ultimately a spectacle film. If you take away the spectacle from Star Wars, the original one anyway, you just get an Akira Kurosawa-esque story that's less impressive than Akira Kurosawa. The effects really did elevate it to this mythic, grandiose state. And it obviously effects are very important in any narrative. You want to make sure that you're able to visually communicate the ideas of the story, but Star Wars had this iconography that lifted from so many sources and coalesced into something distinct. The lightsabers are just the samurai katana from Kurosawa. the various ships are just Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon. Or Star Trek to a lesser extent. Darth Vader, very much, the Emperor, it's very much Sauron and the various henchmen of Sauron, the stormtroopers and orcs ultimately. There are all these different elements you can say and argue, oh, this came from that. Tatooine is basically Arrakis from Dune. Coruscant is basically Tantor from Foundation. It's all these different elements that kind of coalesce into something complete when brought together. It's the pastiche kitchen sink approach to science fiction and fantasy. But it all works so well in elevating the ideas of Star Wars so effectively, I think.
While I would say that Star Wars, it doesn't ever feel like, a world as real, gritty as something like Dune or Lord of the Rings or even Andor, which, I think has really like elevated the world in a different direction to kind of go all in on like the people and everything that isn't just the legend.
Andor is one of the few Star Wars shows that's almost completely divorced from the iconography. That and Skeleton Crew, I think. I think they're two of the better Star Wars stories of recent memory, that they both are stories set in this world with different eras, and they try to use the setting to tell their own narratives that are associated with Star Wars, but not quite aligned with the vision as established in that first original trilogy.
I wouldn't personally, and I haven't seen Skeleton Crew, so I especially can't give an opinion on it, but I wouldn't say that they have to be comparable, given that Andor is obviously for older adult audiences who want to sink their teeth into something a little bit more politically thrilling, something with a little bit more subtext to our world and the various issues going on in it, not just in our current era, but historically. I think what Andor gets right about a dark and gritty extension of a franchise is that it isn't just dark, it is also gritty. And by that I mean it gets into the nitty-gritty of the details of the world and justifies that darkness by grounding it in the nuance that would naturally lend itself to certain realistic concepts feeling like they could exist.
Agreed. And I think one thing, too, that's worth bringing up is if you want to look at Star Wars that is just the iconography, you look at something like The Acolyte, which is, The Acolyte is, here's the thing. The Acolyte has had a lot of potential. I think it's better than some people say it is. That doesn't mean it's necessarily good. The best moments are when it just shows the iconography in its full, unbridled glory. There's a lightsaber fight in the middle of the show. It's the best part of the show by a mile. It's by and away the best part. But the rest of the show is... The problem with the rest of the show is it's not complicated. It's not nuanced. It tries to be, but it never reaches it quite right.
This is a showcase of the platonic ideal of Star Wars, and that is kind of in a state of arrested development right now, whereas Andor decided not to be this is a Star Wars show. It decided to be, this is a sci-fi show with its own themes and ideas set in the Star Wars universe. And I think that distinctive difference is going to decide whether or not we have more shows that are, in my opinion, as good as Andor in the future of this franchise.
Exactly. And it's I think the direction that Andor took the series in, I think is the way to go. Maybe not for every show, but we should really... I think Star Wars owes itself to... These shows help elaborate on details of the world you can focus on. It doesn't have to be like a movie, but longer. Like Obi-Wan or like the Boba Fett series. You gotta look at it okay, how can we explore a corner of the galaxy that has not been filled in yet? So we can just give audiences a little more texture to this world, a little more grounding. Again, that's why I think that Andor and Skeleton Crew and The Mandalorian succeed, whereas something like Obi-Wan doesn't, because it just feels kind of like a movie, just longer and slower, and it doesn't really work as well.
Even some of the standalone movies don't really function as anything other than as Scorsese might put it about a comic book movie, theme parks. Like Solo, for example, it's really all this explains this and this explains this and this explains this. It's a Wikipedia article with better effects. Ultimately, like, while there could have been a better Lord and Miller version of that movie out there, I think that from the get-go, stuff like that and stuff like Obi-Wan, it's so wrongly conceived because it really isn't about the storytelling. It is about giving people more Star Wars. And I think to get more better Star Wars, we need less Star Wars in those Star Wars. It's like, and George might appreciate this, it's like folding a katana. You have to hammer down and fold it many, many times over until, the original sheets of metal may be lost, but you get something that is the finest possible point, and is stronger than the, disparate, opaque elements that were originally used to make it up. It's less blunt and more a singular treasure.
Yes, forged in the fires of Mount Fuji. Folded a million times by the old experts.
The old masters with their powerful philosophical ways that will guide us against all that will threaten this pure land of heroes.
Love it.
I have my criticisms of Joseph Campbell, the man, and of his, story method. But I do have a fondness for the archetypes of young, and I do like, the way that The Lord of the Rings and stuff like Dune and, in my generation, Avatar: The Last Airbender, all have, done those stories with, an appropriate amount of nuance and a new spin on it. Star Wars is something to me that is timeless, but is always... It always needs to, it feels this need to justify itself and earn its place in the current zeitgeist. And I think the reason for that is because it got exceptionally lucky with its spectacle, with its iconography, and with the bits of it that transcended their original context in the minds and dreams of many, many people, in the way that the movie Mad God.
I just mentioned Mad God in this Friday's video, actually, just very briefly, but it's so incredible.
Sick. Okay, there's a quote that Phil Tippett had about Mad God, and it's that Mad God is the dreams you have after you watch Mad God. So, it's not so much the film itself, it's the experience of, keeping it in your head. And I think more than anything, that's what Star Wars is. There's not really a there with it, but it lives in all of us now. It's almost like some kind of force that permeates our existence. I don't know.
Well, I mean, to that extent, I agree. Think about all the science fiction inspired by Star Wars. We're over 45 years removed, almost 50 years removed from the original trilogy release.
There's a lot of it that's really good. A lot of stuff, a lot of good things came from, Star Wars taking off. Star Crash and Star Crash 2 and Star Crash 3 are not three of those things that were good. But we have to acknowledge that influential things that are popular do empower and inspire people to make things that are in some ways better.
Battlestar Galactica, honestly.
Oh yeah.
Heavily inspired by Star Wars.
I think we also wouldn't get the Guardians of the Galaxy in there, which are some of the best Marvel stuff in general, that trilogy, without, Star Wars. I think that, in a way, that's more the Star Wars trilogy of our time than the sequel trilogy is.
I mean, hell, think of it this way. We wouldn't have modern Star Trek without Star Wars. They only brought the movies back because, in as big a deal as they did, because Star Wars was successful. Star Trek would not have come back, and then you wouldn't have Next Gen, you wouldn't have Deep Space Nine, you wouldn't have Voyager, you wouldn't have any of that. You wouldn't have Wrath of Khan, I don't believe. You wouldn't have The Journey Home. You wouldn't have The Undiscovered Country. That all comes because Star Wars opened up the door for people to open up their wallets to watch it in theaters.
Thank you so much for coming on, Ant. This has been a really good chat, and, hopefully the people in the comments who are always like, "Oh, Gus, reveal your deep, dark Star Wars takes." Hopefully, some of them will be satiated.
Oh, I can reveal way deeper and darker Star Wars takes right now if you really want me to, but
Perhaps we'll delve into that on another video. I mean, like, I know we got a little bit into The Last Jedi, but I have way too much to say about that movie in the current year, like, 8 years after its release. But then again, which YouTuber doesn't?
honestly, it's so funny. There was a video that came out 2 days after I made my Star Wars video about how Star Wars was The Last Jedi was objectively the worst movie in all of history. And I'm like, okay, great. That's great. The discourse hasn't died down yet.
Like, any Star Wars movie that has come out isn't even the worst Star Wars like that came out because Rebel Moon exists.
Oh God, Rebel Moon. That movie is. I know someone who actually liked it because they watched it under a certain set of circumstances, we'll say, and thought it was hilarious.
Okay.
And that's about it. That's the only way you can watch it.
The iconography could always be emptier.
Supposedly that was originally pitched as a Star Wars film, and Kathleen Kennedy said no. That's what I heard, and I'm gonna hope that's the case because that means there are some people watching out for us.
Yeah, I mean, and she said yes to Andor, so
that's two things right there.
All right. Well, thank you so much again for coming on, and as for all of you, we'll be seeing you in the near future.